What's up, everybody? I found this paper and it describes how Aborigines all across Australia, which is a really big place, remember there being a lot more land in their specific area. They're not just talking in generalities. They say, no, that island right there used to be a mountaintop, and you could walk from that mountain over to that mountain, which is now an island too. And when I read this, the first thing I thought of was this Zealandia discovery a few years back where all those little white points, those are the islands, I think, today. But scientists have found evidence that this was all one landmass. And this isn't the only place this has been proven. This is known as Doggerland, and ocean levels used to be considerably lower. So the British Isles at one time were connected to mainland Europe. Here, they've discovered all kinds of man-made artifacts and even structures at the bottom of the English Channel. And, you know, people always live on the coast. Even today, something like 90% of the world's population is within 10 miles of a coast or whatever. So I would say that the majority of archaeological evidence for deep past civilizations is 100 meters below sea level. But these Aboriginal tales that have been handed down for generation after generation remember when the water came in and changed the landscape. And they didn't say it was a gradual 10,000 year process. But of course, Quackademia says 85 million years ago, the seafloor spread, blah, blah, blah. But the Aboriginals actually tell their kids stories about when this happened. I can't find it now, but I remember one story that says that they used to be able to walk north a whole lot farther, and they described a land where everybody was wearing turbans. So could they walk to India back in the day? Possibly, and it's possible that Australia used to be a lot closer as well. I want to start off with one of their creation stories. I realize that there are all different flavors out there. To all my friends down under, I've probably read 10 different versions just of the rainbow serpent, and different tribes have different variations on this. But what is really interesting about this is they say that the earth used to be barren before trees, before mountains, before basically any surface features, but it wasn't lifeless. It was just sleeping. And it's really interesting because they say that the rainbow serpent and other, quote, creators were inside of the earth and came up to the surface to create life. So it kind of ties in with Agartha and the idea of inner earth beings, the Hopi ant people, the 7 caves of the Aztecs. There's a lot of stories about beings from in the earth. This is the story of the rainbow serpent. In the beginning, there was no life on the surface of the earth, but beneath the surface, the great mother snake, the rainbow serpent, lay asleep. She slept for a long, long time. Then one day she woke up, uncoiled herself, and crawled into the open. As she moved slowly over the flat, dry, empty land, she said to herself, "This isn't much of a place." So she used her magic to make it rain. I want to point out that in Genesis, one of the creations mentioned in there says that there were no plants because God hadn't made it rain yet. It rained day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, and after a while, the tracks left by the body of the rainbow serpent filled with water. This is how the long winding rivers, the billabongs, and the water holes came into being. Sometimes, as the rainbow serpent moved forward, she pushed her nose into the earth, and the soil piled up in front of her. This is how the mountains, the hills, and the valleys came into being. In some places, the milk from her breast soaked into the earth and made it fertile. And here great rainforests sprang up and all sorts of grasses and carpets of bright-colored flowers. When the rainbow serpent had made the land to her liking, she went back inside the earth and woke the creatures who, like her, had been asleep there. I've talked about this before, but creating life out of nothing is technically impossible. So they're giving the rainbow serpent credit for creating all of the surface features of the earth, but not for just creating life out of nothing. Now, the animals were asleep inside the earth. First, she woke the mammals and led them up to the best places for them to live. The dingoes, who didn't need much water, she took to the desert. The kangaroos, who liked grasses and leaves, she took to the bush. and the amphibious tree frogs, who like things cool, dark, and wet, she took to the rainforest. Then she woke the birds, the eagles who could fly high and far, she took to the mountains. The gala, who could fly only a short distance, she took to the billabongs. And the emus, who couldn't fly at all, she took to the plains where they could run about to their heart's content. Then she woke and brought out the creatures who lived in the water. The barramundi she took to the rivers, the frogs she took to the shallow ponds, and the turtles she took to the lagoons. Next, she woke the insects, the ants, the beetles, the spiders, and the scorpions, and she showed them the rocks, the crevices, and the sandy places where it was best for them to live. Last of all, she brought out a woman and a man, and she took them to a place where there was lots of food and water and taught them the lore by which they should live. What the rainbow serpent taught them was very simple. She told them they were to respect all living creatures, for the kangaroos and the gala and the barramundi were their cousins, children of the same creation. And she told them they were to respect and care for the earth, for its rocks and trees and water holes were sacred, since they too were part of the world she had created. And before she went back to sleep beneath the surface of the earth, so whatever this being is asleep inside of the earth right now, the rainbow serpent gave the woman and the man a warning. She reminded them that they were not the owners of the earth, they were its guardians. And she told them that if through greed or for pleasure they abused the earth instead of caring for it, then she might have to emerge again and create a new world. And in this new world, woman and man would have no place. I'd just like to say to the rainbow serpent, there's a little handful of people that think that they actually do own the earth. So if you want to get rid of them for us, that'd be great. So they believe that our earth was shaped by a number of mythical beings, among them the rainbow serpent. And they believe that these mythical beings actually became part of the earth. There is one tale of these three brothers, and they became these three mountains. And the idea of geological features once being living beings isn't a new subject on here. Also, in Chinese mythology, Pangu chopped the heaven and earth in half with his axe, and his body later became geographic features. In Norse mythology, Ymir was an ice giant. Odin and his brothers used the body of Ymir to create the earth, the sea, and the heavens. So there's a lot of stuff out there about some geological features being alive, and you'll hear it a couple times in these Aboriginal tales. What I find interesting about this is they remember specific details about things. The Naranga tribe had a story which recalled a time when Spencer Gulf was dry land, marshy country reaching into the interior of Australia. In another account, it's described as a valley filled with a line of freshwater lagoons, each associated with a particular type of water bird, while the open country between the lagoons was occupied by emus, curlews, and mallee fowls. Now, the author of this paper calculates that for this to be possible, the minimum sea level would have had to have been 50 feet lower than, or 50 meters lower than today. But what is really interesting is they're not just saying, I heard you could walk across that. They're talking specific animals, and they remember the different birds in the freshwater lakes. The author, of course, is associating this to glacial melt 10,000 years ago. But hey, there's Bronze Age cities at the bottom of the Mediterranean. Now, the oldest stories of the Backstairs Passage was recorded in 1846. Of course, there's different versions, but all involve an ancestral figure named Ngurunduri, whose two wives ran away from him. He pursued them relentlessly along the south coast of the peninsula, finally catching sight of them as they were crossing what was then a strip of land connecting it to Kangaroo Island across the Backstairs Passage. Infuriated, he caused the sea to rise and drown them. The women and their belongings became the islands known as the Pages, and the sea never again receded from the passage. While some mention a strip of land, most talk of a line of boulders between which people could walk or wade, while a few refer to the need to swim to places in order to complete the crossing. The location of the former land bridge is informed by the fact that several versions of the story report that Ngurunduri's wives were swept south into the open ocean by the flood. In the most detailed account, it says the waters began to come in from the west, wave upon wave, driving the two women from their course. At the northwest end of McDonald Bay lies Port McDonald, from which once, quote, the land extended southward as far as the eye could carry. The sole extant version of the story goes on to tell how the now submerged land was forested and bountiful, but owned by a man who would not tolerate thieves. One day he found a woman stealing wattle gum and, enraged, determined to drown her. A tale recorded in 1880 says, he seated himself on the grass, extended his right leg towards Cape Northumberland, and his left towards Green Point, raised his arms above his head, and in a giant voice called upon the sea to come and drown the woman. The sea advanced, covered his beautiful land, and destroyed the offending woman. It returned no more to its former bed, and thus formed the present coast of McDonald Bay. So he called out in a giant voice. A noise was heard. Just so you know, Hunga Tonga a couple years ago, the shockwave was supposed to have gone around the world twice, and the Tunguska event was heard as far away as London. So they could be talking about some ancient giant being that yelled at the ocean to flood everything, or we could have an anthropomorphized mythology of this ancient event. They say of Port Phillip Bay, plenty long ago, men could cross dry foot from one side of the bay in the east to Geelong in the west. They described a hurricane, trees bending to and fro. Then the earth sank and the sea rushed in, till the void places became broad and deep as they are today. Now, we think of land elevations as being static and unchanging, but I did a video a long time ago about Lake Titicaca in Peru, and they estimated that it uplifted by a couple thousand feet in a very short amount of time. Even Quackademia says that the mile-thick glaciers pushed down on the continent, and when they melted, that they sprang back up. So I think that there are rare occasions when you can have either sinking or uplift rather unexpectedly, and I'm still kind of working the theory in my head that plate tectonics is actually just the continents settling. But they say that the sinking of this land was accompanied by a hurricane, so there was a lot going on. Now, here's something that's definitely interesting. Long ago, there was a land to the south of Gippsland where there is now sea, and that at that time some children of the Kurnai who inhabited the land in playing about found a turndun, which I will explain in a minute, which they took home to the camp and showed it to the women. Quote, immediately it is said that the earth crumbled away and it was all water, and the Kurnai were drowned. Now, here's what's crazy about that, is a turndun is also known as a bull roarer. And anybody that grew up back when America was awesome and saw Crocodile Dundee, that was the thing that he was swinging around. I actually made one of these after I saw this. Kids just don't get it today. We had to make things fun back in the day. I mean, I used to trick ski out of the rope swing. But anyway, these can be heard for miles around, so they were communication devices in the bush back in the day. But you guys got to hear one of these things. So they say that the kids brought this back to show it to the women, and immediately the earth crumbled away and it was all water. So you can just imagine what they were hearing, crazy stuff going on. They even remember the different riverways. The river now known as George's River, but then known as Kaima, joined with the Cooks River and flowed through one of the swamps that was once Botany Bay. Together, they then flowed out through the place called Curranula. Then one day, a great storm came up and huge waves washed into the Kaima, destroying much of the swampland used for food gathering. The waves crashed into the shore so fiercely that they washed over the land. Returning sometime later, people said that what they had once known was no longer. Instead of the swamps, there was a great bay, and where the Kaima, there was a high mountain of sand The two rivers now no longer joined together, but ran into the sea separately. In the early 20th century, a story was learned from the lips of Mary Ann, the oldest native woman of Moreton Bay, that she had been told by her parents that the passage between the two islands was in their day but narrow, and that the Noogies of Moreton could easily converse across the gap with the New Knuckles of Stradboke. So that was the early 1900s. She's the oldest person around, so let's say she's 80, 90. So that's changed since the late 1700s, early 1800s, maybe the 1812 event. Tribes of the Hinchinbrook and Palm Island areas tell of a legendary man named Gurigar who traveled across the land naming various places at a time when it was possible to walk to these islands from the mainland. In the Great Barrier Reef area, there are numerous stories about a time when the shoreline was further out where the barrier reef now stands. At this time, a man named Gunya was living here. Having consumed a customarily forbidden fish, the gods caused the sea to rise in order to drown him and his family. He evaded this fate by fleeing to the hills, but the sea never returned to its original limits. So it's crazy that they have the names of the specific people or beings that were here at the time. Well, maybe it's not that crazy if it was just a couple hundred years ago. But here's what I wonder about this is, could something this drastic have happened in Australia and not really affect the rest of the world? Well, I used to not think so, but now I'm kind of thinking that it could have, especially if part of Australia sank. Just last year, and I was really blown away by this, there was a 650-foot tsunami at Dixon's Ford triggered by a huge chunk of melting glacier. Now, this is kind of trapped in by a bay, but I don't know, it just seems like 650 foot would have a ripple effect going a very long distance. But apparently it didn't because the coast of Norway is still there. So I guess you can have a pretty major event in a localized area and then not be noticed somewhere else. And I think what scientists are saying happened 85 million years ago was much, much more recent. Why not just call it a bazillion? That's just ridiculous to me. And what's crazy is they think they've nailed it, not 75 million, 80 million. Meanwhile, the Aboriginals that live there that don't have a writing system or anything, remember the names of the rivers, remember who lived in the area, all by passing down stories word of mouth. One thing that comes to mind about accuracy in a mythology is the Incan tale where the camel talks to the man, and it's just such a out there idea that it sticks with you. So I think the stranger the detail is, the more accurately it's going to be portrayed generation after generation. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll catch you on the next one. Static out.